A long-haired guy was sitting on a chair and carving a car figurine out of wood. It was a man named Albert. He used to live on Earth, but was reincarnated in the body of a beggar. He was in his home. He needed to go through 100 years of training, but now he had only been training for 4 years. The hero entered a room with a large model of the city. He wanted to return to his previous life. Albert looked at the wooden skyscrapers and missed home. The hero walked out of his hut. He was in the territory of the Heavenly Throne sect. The guy pushed off the ground and soared into the air like a bird. Suddenly, a man called out to him. It was Chris. He was also trained in various techniques, but he especially stood out for his physical strength. When Albert landed next to him, the boy began to beg him to teach him the technique of flying. The hero advised Chris to stop training attack techniques and switch to flight. The guy was a little offended by this joke because 100 strength was his calling card. The protagonist explained that 3 months ago, several wild animals escaped from their cages. These creatures seriously mauled Chris. He was bleeding, his clothes were torn. The wild wolves opened their fanged jaws to tear him to pieces. Suddenly, the animals were pierced by sharp stakes that appeared out of nowhere. Albert saved the boy and asked how he was feeling. Chris begged the hero for a long time to teach him such a cool move. After some time, the boy heard that one of the mentors would give a lecture on attacking techniques. Albert believed that defensive techniques were most important, because to survive was to win. Chris went to a lecture, and the protagonist studied the board with new techniques. Among the tablets, there was one special one. It was the ability to use medicinal plants in alchemy. Albert came to a nice girl who was accepting people who wanted to take courses. She stated that there were only 3 free places left and that the course would cost 50 spiritual stones. The hero was a little shocked because for a whole year of work, he received only 100. The girl insisted that it was only possible to learn this technique with the help of a teacher. After some thought, Albert agreed and gave 50 stones. When the hero turned away, the girl recognized him as a fool because he tried to learn alchemy with almost no money. In the evening, Albert strolled through the local market and hoped that his investment would bring benefits. Suddenly, a man called out to him. It was Uncle Brad. The man began to scold the hero for not paying the bride ransom, and Albert felt ashamed. In the past, Brad's daughter Lily and the hero agreed to get married when the guy collected money for the ransom. It was just a joke. The protagonist said goodbye to his father-in-law and headed home, asking him not to tell his daughter about their meeting. Brad said with a smile that Lily already knew. Suddenly, a girl attacked Albert. She was serious. Lily clung to the hero so tightly that he asked her to loosen her grip. The hero told the girl that their engagement was just a bad joke, and the father was angry. Lily was clingy, and according to local tradition, Albert was obliged to marry her. The girl took the hero's gift out of her pocket. The guy tried his best to convince Lily that everything that was happening was just a simple misunderstanding. A tear ran down the hero's cheek. He was in a hopeless situation. Sometime later, having miraculously gotten rid of his crazy bride, Albert headed home and noticed something strange. Chris waved to him from the ground, holding a cute little sheep in his hand. Albert was worried that the local police would catch the guy, but he reassured him, saying that he had bought a sheep, so there was no reason to worry. Chris went to the hero's home to cook the animal. The boy was amazed by the technology that hid the hut under the dome. Chris assured that with his abilities, Albert could become a rather important person in the sect. The hero shut the guy up and asked him to never talk about it again. After a short verbal altercation, the protagonist asked his friend to bring him a sheep. A few minutes later, a magnificent meal prepared using a secret technique was lying on the table. To top off this sumptuous dinner, Chris took a bottle of wine out of his bag. Albert immediately noticed the catch because the guy would never have spent so much money on such an ordinary day. Chris reported that a high-ranking mentor had noticed him, so he would soon leave and would not see the hero for a long time. The guy burst into tears and thanked Albert for saving him. Now they might never see each other again, because Chris would be sent on dangerous missions. After some time, the boys ate the sheep, and Chris thanked the hero for the excellent food. As the boy was about to go out the gate, Albert threw him a scroll. Chris thanked the protagonist again and hurried off to his business. Albert didn't have many friends in this world, so he was very worried about the guy. The next morning, the hero was lounging on a deck chair, planning to grow rice, sell it, and learn alchemy and forging. In this universe, there were kingdoms in which celestial beings lived. To earn such a title, one must devote more than 1,000 years to spiritual training. But Albert could not do them now, because if he died before a certain date, he would not be reborn. The hero created several birds in his palm and launched them into the air. Having flown far enough, they exploded spectacularly. The main character was in despair because he could not show his abilities to anyone, because there would be a person who would decide to kill him out of envy. Suddenly, Albert realized that he could teach new techniques to other people. In addition, future students will be obliged to protect their teacher. Suddenly, the security system reported that someone was trying to scan the location of the hero's house. The guy decided not to pay attention to such a trifle, but rather to focus on new techniques. He came up with a spell that would allow him to take the soul of a beast and place it in a new body when needed. To test his idea, Albert grabbed a sparrow flying past. The hero, using complex technology, was able to turn the bird into porcelain. But unfortunately, the sparrow did not fly, but fell right on Albert's head. The frustrated hero admitted that he needed to train even more. At this time, Chris was in the forest and laughing. It turned out that he easily killed a wild cat thanks to the technique that the main character taught him. In the morning, a man came to Chris. He hoped that the guy would not be attacked by a dangerous animal. At the sight of the dead cat, the man dropped the fox carcass from his hands and was very surprised. The fighter couldn't even imagine that such a talented guy would join them. In total, there were 4 ranks of fighters in this world, starting from D and ending with A. Level A masters received the very best and were trained to become the future elite. Chris, suspecting that his comrade was shocked by his capabilities, put on an innocent face. The man encouraged the boy by saying that he would need to kill a few more beasts to earn an A rank. By the evening, Chris managed to get to Albert's house and told him what had happened. The guy suggested that the hero also join the combat squad. His skills would be very useful there. Albert did not like to kill and was afraid of dying himself. Besides, warriors occupied a lower position than alchemists. Chris tried to convince the hero that, in his opinion, the ability to instill terror in enemies is every man's dream. The guy assured that the main character's abilities could even elevate him to the status of a celestial being. Plus, Chris will be able to travel there with him. Albert asked why the boy so wanted to get into the kingdom of heaven. The hero tried to convince his friend that that world was too cruel and terrible. The protagonist cut a piece of meat in half with a spell and shared it with Chris. Greedily eating the delicacy, the boy offered Albert to take him on as an apprentice. The hero couldn't believe his ears. He imagined Chris as a future A-rank fighter. The young man told that one of his ancient ancestors was a wise warrior. After his death, the family fell into decline, but he left a list in which almost all of his knowledge was recorded. From them, Chris read about the fierce fighters of other sects. The Heavenly Arrow sect is considered the most powerful in the world. People who studied old and created new techniques were called spellcasters. Chris begged Albert to make him such a master of spells. The hero said that the boy was already 18, so it was too late for him to become a student. Using an unusual technique, the protagonist erased a small fragment of his friend's memory. Chris didn't remember anything. Albert reminded that he wanted to become an A-rank warrior and asked to teach him a couple of techniques. The guy made a cute face as if he were a kitten and thanked his friend for his help. The next day, the hero wrote down everything he learned from Chris. He was filled with knowledge of this world. Albert wondered if he could reach the central continent. The protagonist cast aside these bad thoughts and decided to take a day off. After a while, the guy got bored and dreamed of a computer with internet access. The prospect of a century of training did not appeal to him. Suddenly, a huge flying ship appeared right above the hero's house. The ship was guarded on all sides by specially trained fighters on Firebirds. Albert decided that it was an expedition that had gone in search of valuable resources. The hero was distracted by a knock at the gate. Chris was standing on the threshold. The guy didn't look well. He injured his leg while doing the task, so he took the day off. Albert scolded Chris for not using his flying technique to defend himself. The hero called his friend a lousy fighter who doesn't think ahead. In fact, Chris came to Albert to get advice on how to kill the mighty beast. The hero did not agree. The guy reproached him for hiding the true power of his abilities from everyone. After some deliberation, the magician decided to train Chris in exchange for information about flying ships. Albert moved through the air and transported himself and his comrade into a certain space. It was a training illusion. Chris was supposed to have a test fight. The magician created a stone-praying mantis, and the fighter had only 15 minutes to deal with it. The insect attacked Chris so suddenly that he barely dodged it. The guy released several fire pikes at his enemy. The mantis easily dodged the projectiles, and the fighter was perplexed. Albert admitted that Chris moved quite quickly, but released his pikes too slowly. The guy was angry because he couldn't deal with such a simple enemy. Suddenly, the mantis dealt him a powerful blow, and Chris was thrown back. The fight ended, and the guy was very upset by the defeat. Albert advised him to watch the enemy's behavior and predict his movements. The hero put 2 fingers to the guy's forehead. He suggested that he use a technique that would restrict the enemy's movements. The magician suggested that Chris have another training session in the future to work on his shortcomings. Albert sat down in a businesslike manner on a chair and asked his friend to tell him everything about flying ships. The guy said that 500 years ago, the Supreme Mentor collected everything that the sect's servants had and went to the central continent to build a ship. Because the inhabitants had nothing left, they suffered from hunger and went mad at the sight of the spiritual stones. After some time, the Mentor returned on a brand new ship, and life in the sect began to improve. On the ship, the ruler planned to collect resources from the Great Sea, which was considered endless. The ship had the ability to fly to protect itself from deep-sea monsters. There were also rumors that it was possible to go beyond the celestial border with it. Chris pointed to the blue sky. Albert thought the guy meant space, but unfortunately, only the most developed sects could leave the kingdom. The hero asked if it was possible to get on board the ship and inspect it. Chris explained that spell researchers and A-rank warriors were allowed in there. Masters of alchemy and forging, and of course the captain of the ship itself, could also get on board the ship. Albert's dreams of getting there were shattered because, at best, he would have to train for hundreds of years and try not to die. Chris offered him to join the combat squad together to make it easier, but the hero refused. The magician explained that he would now be busy selling rice to pay for the forging and alchemy courses. The next morning, Albert arrived at the alchemy training halls. He thought to himself about how to quickly return to his world to his beloved parents. The protagonist approached the man standing at the gate and introduced himself as a new student. The man explained that the boy would have to pay 500 spiritual stones for 2 years of training. Albert was very reluctant to part with his money. Behind the gate, the hero saw a very tall tower. He was impressed. The guy accompanying the magician wondered why such poor people were getting involved in alchemy. The man hypocritically wished Albert success in his studies and said goodbye. The hero entered the classroom and saw a bunch of students. Suddenly, he smelled a pleasant, sweet scent of perfume. This scent emanated from the beautiful girl standing in the center of the office. Albert, struck by her beauty, introduced himself and asked who she was. The girl called herself Claire. She was the teacher's daughter and could conduct the lesson in his absence. The hero answered her hesitantly, and she thought that he was unwell. Albert lied when he said he was worried about falling behind other students. The girl calmed the hero down and offered to give him private lessons. The lesson began, and Claire asked the protagonist to listen to her very carefully. Albert noted that events were developing too quickly. It seemed he had fallen in love. The guy began to imagine how he would have to be alone with her in the evening. These thoughts made the hero very excited, and his nose started bleeding. At this time, Claire announced that today they would be studying plant processing techniques. Albert was incredibly happy. He could finally become a master of alchemy. After a month, he was able to begin real training of his skills. Now he was learning the technique of non-contact use of fire. The hero was surprised because he thought he had mastered her with ease. Suddenly, the pot exploded and left a trail of soot on Albert's face. The novice alchemist was very scared. These cauldrons were very expensive. To his regret, he discovered a rather large crack on it. It was believed that to create his first pill, a student had to spend 20 cauldrons, and to become a mentor, more than 1,000. Albert confidently decided to keep trying. The rules didn't apply to him. A short time later, 2 more explosions occurred, and the hero's clothes were badly damaged. The student looked into the cauldron and burst into tears of joy. He had succeeded. The hero understood how to do it and decided that now he would be able to recoup the cost of the boiler and make a little profit. The next day, he went to the alchemy training hall again. Mentor Thomas, who was also Claire's father, asked if any of his students had been able to complete his task of creating the pill. The students' faces twisted and sweat ran down them, but only Albert remained calm. The budding alchemists admitted that they had blown up more than 1 cauldron. Suddenly, the mentor stared very intently at the protagonist. Thomas created a noise barrier and asked his daughter to be more careful with it. The teacher explained that he saw serious potential in him. Later, the hero returned to training, trying to do everything without mistakes in order to save up for a new boiler. Suddenly, he heard a noise in the lighthouse. Apparently, he had a neighbor. He approached the building and Lily jumped on him. The girl decided to visit her husband and reported that she had reached a new level of her abilities. Lily pushed off the ground and began to float in the air. The girl boasted that one mentor wanted to take her as a student. Albert praised Lily. She also reminded him of the ransom that the hero must bring to his father. The magician offered to cook dinner for Lily. The girl thanked her husband for the delicious food, and the hero reminded her that their wedding was just a joke. The guy considered himself an unsuitable candidate to be her husband. At these words, Lily flooded the entire table with her tears. 3 hours later, the girl was still crying, and Albert tried to calm her down. He eventually agreed to pay ransom for her. Lily immediately calmed down and began to eat rice. Albert was furious that he was simply being used. The hero resigned himself to this wedding and sweetly stroked the bride's head. After a while, the main character was devouring a delicious pancake. The girl really wanted to try it. Suddenly, a beautiful woman with a blue bird appeared in the sky. At the sight of her, Albert's mouth began to water, like a dog at the sight of a piece of meat. The hero hoped that the system had taken pity on him and given him a beauty for all his suffering. The girl stated that she had come here for a man from the Heavenly Throne sect. Albert decided that they were talking about him and was already preparing to go with the stranger. Suddenly, the woman lifted Lily into the air and offered to become her mentor. A projection of a man appeared in the air, and he asked not to take the girl with them because they needed another person. The girl insisted on her own, declaring that their destinies were connected. Lily asked the hero what she should do. Many predatory eyes were looking at Albert, and he felt uneasy. The guy replied that Lily should not miss such an opportunity. The bride wanted to visit her lover. The woman allowed her to do so. Lily was the bearer of the heavenly spirit. The guy she chose was chosen by heaven. The girl agreed, and the teacher seated her on her blue bird. They flew away. Albert was glad. He finally got rid of his annoying wife. The hero became motivated to become stronger and decided to study the recently purchased book of techniques. Suddenly, a very strong and courageous guy appeared on the threshold of his house. It was Chris. He was killing animals in the forest, stronger than him. The guy returned to rest. The guy asked how to deal with the two remaining enemies. They were too strong. One of them was an earth eater, a monster that would bury itself in the ground when it saw danger. The second was a very fast cat that could inflict fatal wounds. Chris asked his friend to teach him a technique to defeat them. Albert agreed, but this training would be more difficult than the previous one. Now he has created two praying mantises with the abilities of an earth eater and a cat. While the hero was explaining to Chris how to deal with them, one of the insects attacked him. The magician pierced the enemy with one gesture, without even flinching. The guy was shocked by his friend's abilities. Suddenly, Chris was attacked by another praying mantis. Albert finished off the nasty insect again with just one blow. The boy begged the magician to teach him such a powerful technique. The main character made fun of his friend and said that he needed to shave his head to learn this ability. Finally, the guy through tears agreed. Albert looked at his comrade and laughed very loudly. Chris shaved anyway, and the hero praised him for his courage, barely holding back his laughter. The upset guy asked why the main character was so strong, but not shaved. The Joker said that he was not trying to become stronger, so there was no need for a haircut. Albert pushed his friend to the gate and ordered him to practice this technique at home. Now that he had dealt with the annoying comrade, it was time to get down to important matters. 3 months later, Lily was already flying on a bluebird in an unknown kingdom. The mentor reproached the girl that her skills were worthless and that it was too early for her to think about returning home. The woman remembered a recent nightmare. Monsters circled around her, and she herself was chained and pierced with a spear. It was a sign of disaster, and she believed that only Lily could prevent it. The young girl asked permission to go for a walk and meet her husband. The mentor allowed her to take a little walk, but forbade her to see her lover. Meanwhile, Albert decided to visit the forging training hall. He was dazzled by the sight of a crowd of shining heads of students. One of the students told a friend that his friend from the combat unit shaved and became very strong. The main character regretted his actions. His joke turned out to be rather unsuccessful. After some time, most of the sect's disciples shaved their heads, which caused a real sensation. Meanwhile, the hero complained that learning forging was too hard. He had already spent 10,000 stones. Suddenly, the guy saw his old friend and called out to him. It was his friend named Dylan. He was quite plump and came from a wealthy family. The fat man heard about Albert's success in alchemy and decided to reward him with a spiritual stone, but the boy refused. The hero suspected that Dylan had business with him. The magician invited the guy over and treated him to a cup of tea. The fat man explained that he had come up with the idea of uniting students studying outside the sect. Albert was surprised by this. He thought that he did not care about ordinary people because he was the descendant of a wealthy family. Dylan planned to create a kind of alliance of people willing to help each other. For his assistance in this matter, the hero will be able to receive news from the sect among the first. He will also be able to make useful connections by teaching inexperienced newcomers. Dylan was confident that the alliance would flourish if Albert joined them. As a parting gift, the fat man gave the magician a magic ball to maintain communication. Albert said goodbye to his old friend. Suddenly, a very familiar voice began to whisper in his ear. The hero turned around and saw Claire. He explained that he was just seeing a friend. The beauty suggested going to Albert's house. He had never seen such beautiful girls in real life. The guy kindly treated her to some delicious tea. Claire was very nervous. The girl felt uneasy and began to notice something strange about herself. In her thoughts, she admitted that the more she looked at the hero, the more she realized that she had fallen in love. Claire reproached herself. She must not forget the true purpose of her visit. She placed her hands on the table imperiously and asked why Albert did not want to become part of the alchemy department. Claire moved even closer. She was worried because the hero did not want to become her father's student. The protagonist confessed to everything. Alchemy was just a way to make money by selling pills. The girl begged him not to kill his talent and to find a mentor. Albert decided to reveal his plan. He asked Claire if she was on board the flying ship. The girl answered positively, and the hero spoke about his dream of building one for himself. The magician didn't want Claire's father to waste his time and energy teaching him. The beauty seemed to be furious at what she heard. She remembered how her brother left the family to become the best blacksmith master. The girl's gaze became sad, and she asked Albert not to give up. Claire left. The main character looked after her for a long time. The guy enjoyed the freedom and the fact that he had no obligations to anyone. Suddenly, Dylan's magic ball began to vibrate in his pocket. All the news of the sect was written in it. Among them was the news about Chris. It turned out that the guy started dating the most beautiful student of the sect named Eva. The future warrior talked a lot about Albert, and they decided to visit him. The main character congratulated his friend on the fact that he was able to win the heart of such a good girl. The magician suggested talking inside the hut. Chris said that Eva was infected by a monster while they were on a mission, and now the girl couldn't sleep normally. Albert used the aura cleansing technique to help her. A soul eater flew out of the girl's body. The protagonist killed the spirit and asked his friend to be careful. Eva admired the magician's skill and offered to go with them to open the secret portal. The hero considered this venture too risky, so he refused. Chris mentioned that you can stumble upon something valuable in the portal, even the records of the forging masters. Albert pricked up his ears, his eyes lighting up with excitement. The hero agreed, but now he needed 1,000 spiritual stones to enter. In the evening, he began to study the basics of forging in order to be as prepared as possible. This activity required a lot of things: raw materials, runes, spiritual fire. The most important thing is to insert the rune into the object while it is still warm. Albert found forging more interesting than alchemy lessons. Dylan praised the protagonist for learning two crafts at once. The fat man decided to share with him the secret of combining these activities. Later, the magician went to the forge halls. He gave the duty officer a spiritual stone and asked him to provide him with a room. Everything necessary to start training was here. The room was very hot, so Albert used the ice armor technique. To begin with, he decided to cross scarlet steel and iron ore. Dylan said that a person studying forging and alchemy should not count on help from heaven. The hero began to forge metals. First, he processed the ore with hammers. Now the blacksmith added molten steel and formed the sword. It was time to insert the runes. The hero decided to make it hard as a rock and light as a feather. Unfortunately, the weapon exploded at the final stage. Albert was depressed. He wasted 400 spirit stones. A man entered the room and asked what had happened. It was the manager blacksmith's halls. The hero was ashamed of his incompetence. The magician came up with a plan. The man is obliged to teach him, otherwise he will not go anywhere. 3 days later, Chris and Eva were flying to the entrance of the secret portal. Suddenly, something flashed past them. It was Albert. He felt sorry for the poor crane on which the couple was flying. Chris was amazed that his friend was riding on a forged sword. The immodest protagonist asked to be called the Forging Master from now on. The long-bearded man announced the rules for being on the other side of the portal. Chris hoped that the hero would go with them, but he destroyed his hopes. Instead, he gave him a special crystal. The guy could send a signal, and Albert would come to the rescue. The fighter thanked his friend. The main character flew into the open portal at lightning speed. The hero, left alone, looked at the beautiful landscape of the green forest. He had to spend a whole month here, so the magician decided to build a small base here. Suddenly, wild animals jumped on him out of nowhere. Albert turned around and looked at them with a terrible look. He used a special technique against them, and ordered them to bring useful things. The hero set out to search for the runes left here by the forging masters. On the way, the magician came across a small lake and decided to examine it. Suddenly, a column of water shot out of it as if a volcano had erupted. An unknown guy stood on the water's surface, apparently also from the Heavenly Throne sect. The young man introduced himself as Nicholas. His face was beautiful. Albert was in a state of shock. The stranger was holding a magic sword in his hand. The protagonist greeted him and informed him that he was an outer disciple of the sect. Nicholas was glad to meet him. He looked like the main character. The young blacksmith did not understand what he wanted. The boy extended his hand to Albert. In his palm lay a beautiful pearl. It seemed he wanted the magician not to tell anyone about the things he had found. The hero thought that Nicholas was also a real person who had ended up in this world. The magician began to ask him questions related to the culture of the earth. The young man insisted that he did not understand what was being discussed. The protagonist accepted the pearls and promised to keep his mouth shut. Nicholas said goodbye to the stranger kindly. Albert decided to keep his distance from him. The young man jumped on his sword. He believed that their paths might still cross. The hero would not want to be nearby if something bad happened to him. Nicholas left behind only eyeless turtles in the lake. By evening, Albert had collected a large number of various resources and was resting in the hut. Suddenly, there was a knock on the front door, and the hero became wary. Opening the door, he saw a bunch of green eyes in front of him, looking at him angrily. The guy decided that there was a whole crowd of ghosts standing in front of him. He was scared to death. It turned out that these were wolves he had tamed, and Albert calmed down. They brought with them several flowers, a piece of red copper, tree fruits, and spiritual stones. The tired animals immediately went to bed, and the hero realized that they had collected all this from the corpses. The magician hid the hut from prying eyes with the help of technology and went to bed. To his surprise, the hero woke up early and decided to have breakfast. From behind him, he heard the sound of a man flying on a sword. It was Nicholas. He sheathed his weapon and greeted the protagonist in a friendly manner. Albert invited the wanderer to eat with him. The young man was simply delighted with the taste of the freshly cooked soup. The hero asked the boy what he was doing, and he explained that he was a candidate to become the apprentice of the master swordsman Harry. The aspiring blacksmith predicted a great future for him with such a mentor. Nicholas told his story. He used to be a bright student, but his abilities began to fade. Now he is forced to accumulate wealth in every possible way so that if he becomes a common citizen, he can live a normal life. Albert encouraged the boy and advised him not to give up, in case his strength returned. Nicholas approached the hero and sincerely thanked him for his words of support. The young man expressed a desire to become friends with the main character. The magician remained silent, but in his head he did not want to start such a friendship. An hour later, Albert came across a huge spiritual tree from which he could build a flying ship. He took out his magic sword and prepared to cut it. Suddenly, a giant wild bear ran out of the thicket towards him. Confident in his powers, the hero ordered the sword to attack the monster. To my surprise, right at the moment of impact, the animal's fur turned to stone. A moment later, the bear rushed to attack again, but immediately howled in unbearable pain. It turned out that Albert had used the technique of invisible deadly needles, and the beast's lifeless body fell to the ground. Half a day later, the protagonist finally finished building his ship. Suddenly, the alarm went off, meaning Chris was in trouble. The hero immediately boarded his ship and went to help his friend. At this time, Chris was saving his beloved Ava from wild bees. The girl was scared to death and hoped that Albert would still make it to their rescue. Suddenly, the bees shot their stingers straight at the couple. They were deadly. The guy held his beloved tightly in his arms. His eyes seemed to be burning. Chris ate the acceleration pill at lightning speed and managed to dodge the projectiles. Meanwhile, the protagonist noticed them using a vision-enhancing technology. Chris and Eva were incredibly happy. They would finally be saved. Unfortunately, the angry bees surrounded the couple, and the situation became almost hopeless. Albert stood on the edge of the ship and prepared for battle. He used the sound wave destruction technique. It was too strong. The souls left the bees. Their lifeless bodies began to fall to the ground like drops of rain. The main character hooked his friends with a special hook and began to lift them onto the ship. After some time, the hero was frying meat over a fire. He was squeezed out like a lemon. Chris woke up and thought he was in hell and started screaming. The guy rushed to hug his beloved. Albert threw him an elixir that would help cope with the consequences of the sound wave. Chris began to thank his friend. He had saved his life twice already. The hero scolded the guy and demanded 22,000 spiritual stones for saving him and the elixir. Eva woke up and pinched her beloved on the butt, and he jumped in pain. The girl clung to Chris and began to cry with happiness. They were alive. She thanked Albert from the bottom of her heart, and he asked who came up with the idea to go to the bees. Chris scratched the back of his head in shame. He just wanted to try out the escape technique the hero had taught him. In addition, insects had honey that could cure diseases, and the guy planned to cure Eve's mother. In this way, Chris hoped to reduce the ransom amount for the girl. Albert remembered how in his past life, relationships also took a lot of money from him. The couple managed to get only half of what they had planned, which should have been enough. Eva said that such a jar could cost up to 2,000 spiritual stones. The main character asked them to tell him where he could be found. After a while, the hero was already riding on a deer into a bamboo grove, where a lair of wild bees was located. The boy ordered the animal to hide, and he himself headed deeper into the thicket. After 3 days, he finally came across the insects and began to seduce them. The bees mistook him for a beautiful queen. Now they were under the power of the protagonist and bowed before him. The magician finally found mountains of honey that would make him rich. Suddenly, a real queen bee appeared. She did not succumb to the hero's influence. The guy used a consciousness-paralyzing technique against her. The bee was invulnerable because it and the honey are the property of the Heavenly Throne sect, and disciples are allowed to take a maximum of 1,000 liters. The main character was deeply saddened. His magnificent plan for getting rich had failed. One of the elders was watching the magician and was amazed by the boy's abilities. Albert began to collect honey, but the elder's voice from the sky ordered him to stop. A few minutes later, the hero loaded 500 liters of liquid onto his ship and set off. Right above him, he noticed a trace of a magic sword. Apparently, it was Nicholas again. The young man approached the mountains of honey and began to calculate his future fortune. Suddenly, a pillar of light fell from the sky, and the elder created a dome that forbade anyone to approach the grove for the next 150 years. During his air travel, the hero came across the estate of an alchemist master. Albert was furious. All this time, he was trying to find the blacksmith master. There was only 1 hour left before the portal closed. The magician had to hurry. In the estate, he discovered a bunch of scrolls with quite useful spells. The hero remembered that the portal would close very soon. The guy miraculously managed to get out of there, and Chris and Eva were already meeting him at the exit. The guy suggested that Albert go to the tavern and thank him for saving him. The protagonist agreed. This month had been very difficult. After a long time, the magician was already at home and lying on piles of spiritual stones. He managed to sell the honey. He sent a letter to the Alliance base for Dylan. The hero exchanged 300,000 spiritual stones for a bunch of forging resources. After 3 years of blacksmithing, he still couldn't insert some runes correctly. Albert came up with the idea of using another rune as a mediator. The hero decided to try to put his idea into practice. The fragments came together to form a brand new magic sword. The blacksmith rushed to embrace him as if he were a loved one. Now the weapon was called the Thousander. The main character received news from the sect through a magic ball. A recruitment of blacksmiths for training had opened. Over these long 3 years, Albert has already developed to the 8th level. He had no doubt that he would soon be able to fight on equal terms with a much stronger enemy. Thanks to his beast summoning technique, the hero could call upon an entire dragon for help. Soon the magician finally returned home and sprawled out on the lounger. Chris and Eva appeared on the threshold. They were incredibly happy. The guy shared the good news that they would soon be getting married, and he asked Albert to be sure to come to the celebration. The main character and the lovers had a nice dinner. He believed that he had no time for a relationship. After the meal, the magician stood up from his chair and asked to follow him. Chris and Eva were perplexed. He led them into a room where weapons and shields he had forged hung on the walls. The hero didn't have a wedding gift, so he offered the couple to choose anything. Eva asked if she could take the swords of insight. They were very useful in battle. Chris asked permission to take the 1,000 round, which could crumble into pieces and take any shape. Albert gave them the chosen weapons and saw them off. Deep in his soul, he regretted the time and resources spent on forging them. A month later, the hero went to the capital of the sect. There would soon be a wedding. He was carrying a giant sack on his back, and the journey to the ceremony site was not short. Luckily, the magician had a flying ship, and he called it to lighten his load. Suddenly, the hero heard a familiar sound from behind. It seemed to be Nicholas again. The guy was incredibly happy to see his friend after 3 years. The young man immediately noticed the magic ship. Nicholas said that he was going to his friend's wedding. Albert was stunned and asked if his name was Chris. The young man was wildly delighted. He would finally be able to spend time with the hero. Nicholas offered to get there on his personal ship. It was much better than the main character's vessel. When Albert boarded, the ship flew at supersonic speed. Carrying Nicholas offered the hero a whole buffet as a sign of friendship. Suddenly, the guy jumped up and asked to wait while he dealt with some insects. He threw 5 balls of different elements at the enemy at once, and the hero envied his skill. Albert saw 5 hostile people opposite the bow of the ship. Nicholas apologized for the inconvenience. He planned to distract the enemies and send the ship with the magician to its destination. The 5 began to quickly approach the heroes. The young man warned that he would deal with any of the enemies. The enemies responded to his words only with mockery. It seems they are confident in their own strength. One of the enemies ordered a guy named Henry to deal with the main character. Nicholas tried to stop Henry to protect Albert. Unfortunately, the gang leader interrupted his actions. He advised the young man to try to protect himself at the moment. A column of fire burst into the sky out of nowhere, and a major explosion occurred. At this time, Albert promised himself never to leave the sect again, so as not to get into similar situations. His thoughts were interrupted by Henry, who suddenly ran towards him. The hero decided to use the technique he had been putting off until an emergency. The soul of a giant dragon burst into the air from the small bowl. The soul climbed inside the wooden copy of the beast. The enemy became even more determined. He was anticipating a wonderful battle. The boy set his pet centipede on Albert, but the dragon killed it with one swipe of its paw. The hero's eyes lit up. He felt superiority over his opponent. The hero ordered the beast to deal with Henry, and it immediately attacked him. The guy was bleeding, but he wasn't going to give up, so he used an unknown technique. The protagonist used all kinds of barriers to protect himself from her. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed. It turned out to be a technique for damaging the psyche. Albert lost consciousness and fell straight overboard the ship. In some mountains there was a hut. The sister asked her brother when they would eat meat. The boy said that first he needed to cure the stranger, who turned out to be the main character. The magician was incredibly grateful to fate for such salvation. It turned out that Albert had been fighting a giant worm in the astral dimension for half a month and had finally won. The main character woke up and sat on the bed. He thanked the children with all his heart for their care. The children bowed down, as they believed, before the celestial being and begged him to take them as disciples. The hero did not see any potential in them and asked why they needed it. The brother and sister loudly declared that they just wanted to eat tasty meat every day. Albert was touched by their sincere honesty. The protagonist used the technique. First, they must pass the test of the spirit. The boy felt sorry for the kids, so even if they failed the test, he would provide them with a comfortable life. Unfortunately, the hero spent a lot of energy fighting the worm, and now he will have to spend a long time recovering. The magician promised himself not to leave the sect for the next 10 years. Also, you need to stay away from Nicholas to avoid getting into a similar situation. Albert decided to make more fighting dolls upon returning home. Suddenly, a mature man with a cane in his hands entered the hut. The man knelt before the great celestial being. The hero asked him to get up and offered to thank him for saving him. The stranger said that all he wanted was to live to a ripe old age with his beloved wife. The guy gave the man a bottle containing longevity pills. The man asked what was happening with the children. The hero replied that he was checking them before taking them to the sect, where they would be taken care of. The stranger left, and the hero took out the balls with the children's spiritual powers. In the boy's ball, he saw his brother taking care of him until old age. The sister wanted to become a great warrior so that everyone would admire her. The hero admitted that after awakening, the children's lives would never be the same. At this time, Chris was sitting at the gate of Albert's hut. He was depressed. The guy blamed himself for what happened to the main character, because it was he who invited him to the wedding. Ava tried to cheer up her beloved and assured him that the magician was now alive and simply healing his wounds. Chris promised himself that he would wait for his friend at the gate until he showed up. The girl sat down next to her lover. They hoped for the best. Meanwhile, Albert arrived at the sect's foreign affairs office and persuaded the leader to make the children his disciples. After that, they rushed away on a ship. The brother asked if it was difficult to become like a hero. The magician said it was easy if they listened to him carefully. The boy had already begun to dream of a daily portion of meat for himself and his sister. The protagonist just laughed and offered them as much meat as they wanted in the future. Suddenly, Chris sensed a familiar spiritual aura. It was Albert. The guy immediately rushed to hug his friend. Chris looked at his brother and sister, who had arrived with the hero. The guy thought they were the main character's children, but Eva immediately admitted that this was just nonsense. The magician hastened to calm his friend's imagination and called them his students. Albert didn't know the children's names, so he asked them to introduce themselves. The boy explained that they don't have them. They are given out for finding special plants named after them. In this situation, the main character came up with names for them. Now the girl was called Kate and her brother Kevin. The children were so grateful that they bowed before their new mentor. To begin with, Albert decided to dress up his students a little. Two pink flying spheres merged with the children's clothes. Now the brother and sister had very beautiful and comfortable suits. Eva, standing nearby, was surprised by such a useful technique. The hero suggested that the girl try to use the magic ball herself. Eva applied it and ended up with a very revealing outfit. The main character begged her to change clothes while Chris covered Kevin's eyes with his other hand. The other outfit was no better than the previous one. Now the girl had transformed into a semblance of a cat. Albert asked her to return everything back and try using it at home. After this awkward situation, Chris suggested celebrating the arrival of the new students. The magician offered the children to try the meat dish, and they were simply delighted. When the kids walked away, Chris reached into his pocket. A moment later, he handed the hero a red envelope and asked him to accept it. A few days later, the protagonist went to the forge again. He had a bunch of orders. The old man walking behind him reproached the boy for fulfilling commercial orders when every blacksmith was important to the sect. Albert informed him of the situation that had happened on the way to the wedding and promised to help the other blacksmiths soon. The old man asked the boy to show his creation for the day, and he unfolded a large box. The stranger lifted the lid and saw a very skillfully forged sword. The old man suggested that the hero leave the orders for now and instead go with him to repair the sect's ship. They jumped into the magic carriage and set off on their journey. Albert kept looking around, admiring the views of previously unknown territories. Suddenly, two scary dragons appeared next to the transport. The old man only laughed at the fear on the hero's face. The animals were guarding the sect. The man also offered to ride them for just 10,000 spiritual stones. The guy politely declined. He had no desire to spend such a large sum on stupid entertainment. After some time, they finally reached the damaged ship. The old man explained the terms of the job. For every square meter, the hero would receive 1,000 stones, and as a bonus, he would also receive 20 new runes. The man advised him to watch the others work until the master arrived. Albert went to inspect the ship. Later, the foreman approached him and asked if the guy was ready for work. The hero already understood what was required of him. The master advised him to work at maximum speed. The main character melted metals and fused them into the stern of the ship. The master was delighted with how well and quickly the newcomer worked. After 2 months, the restoration of the ship's hull was finally completed. Albert asked the blacksmith if there was any more work for him, but the man replied that there was not. Thanks to the hero's skill, the work was completed a whole month ahead of schedule. The master predicted a great future for him. The man wanted to help the magician in this difficult task and extended his palm with 5 runes. The protagonist accepted the gift and promised to make for the master whatever he wanted. After the conversation, the hero decided to explore the place a little. The territory was too large, so the hero would have to come up with a way to get there himself. At this time, Chris and Eva were fighting wild animals far from the sect. The guy offered his wife to exchange the points for this task for an embryonic pill. He planned to send his future child to Albert as an apprentice. Suddenly, another pack of wild animals came rushing towards them. There were 3 very strong enemies among the animals. Chris and Eva could not retreat. The situation seemed hopeless. The guy would have to use the rescue ball he acquired from the hero. He swung and threw it upward with all his might. The ball broke into small burning fragments. The animals did not understand what was happening. A moment later, there was a very powerful explosion, and nothing remained of the flock. The couple approached the crater left by the explosion. Chris felt ashamed that he had wasted such a valuable artifact to defeat stupid animals. Eva suggested that her beloved arrange a sparring match with the main character to hone his skills. Suddenly, the husband and wife noticed an unknown green glow at the bottom of the crater. It was a giant piece of iron ore, enriched with spiritual energy. Chris once heard that it could be used to make armor that would protect against the strongest opponents. The guy threw Eva a bag of useful pills in battle and ran off to mine ore. After some time, the couple came to Albert. As it turned out, he had recently moved. The hero presented his new development to his friends. The armor of God, made using enriched iron ore. Chris was amazed by their appearance. The hero suggested that he try them out. The guy didn't even have to do anything. The armor just stuck to him. Chris was able to rise into the air. Eva watched him with admiration. The guy was able to switch the suit to attack mode. He concentrated the energy in his palm and fired it at a nearby stone block. Chris was amazed by the power of this armor. The guy jumped onto the thousand tree and flew through the air like lightning. He congratulated Albert from the bottom of his heart for such a cool development, and the hero thanked them for the ore they provided. The magician also said that he would soon be leaving on an expedition on a sex ship, so he asked his friends to keep an eye on his students. The couple promised to look after them as if they were their own children. The protagonist prayed to fate that he would never meet Nicholas again. A month later, Albert was already heading to the place where the expedition was being prepared. The hero was delighted by the sight of this majestic ship. The magician, along with other passengers, proceeded on board the ship. To his regret, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It was Nicholas again. The guy hugged his old friend. The hero dreamed of leaving the ship as soon as possible. The young man asked a crew member to put Albert in the cabin next to his. In the evening, all the passengers were having dinner in the dining room. The main character planned to sneak off to the toilet unnoticed. Suddenly, as if out of thin air, Nicholas appeared. He praised the local food. His main goal was to win the hero's respect. Albert asked his friend how he dealt with his problem of losing strength. Nicholas claimed that his affliction simply disappeared as soon as he emerged from that portal 3 years ago. He also talked about how he then returned to the girl with whom he had broken off his engagement. He beat up all her brothers, but she dealt with him with just one blow of her hand. The guy promised himself to become stronger in order to regain his lost honor. Drunk Nicholas rushed to hug the main character. He didn't like it very much. In fact, the guy went on an expedition to explore unknown ruins that he noticed during repairs. Instead, he has to endure Nicholas's antics. Suddenly, the stranger put his hand on Albert's shoulder. The guy was shocked. Raising his head, he saw a mysterious man in front of him. An unknown person offered the main character to become his student. The man noted his strong spiritual energy, and the guy became a little embarrassed. The stranger offered the hero to become part of the forging department. Albert thanked him for the offer, but stated that he was just an amateur and that he liked alchemy better. The man was angry at the lost talent and left. The hero waved after him. The magician did not want to join anyone in order to maintain his independence. Nicholas couldn't understand how his friend could refuse such a tempting offer. Albert was scared to death by his comrade who had sneaked up on him. Nicholas thought the guy was lying about alchemy, but the hero denied his assumptions. The main character hid this so as not to attract unnecessary attention. After these words, the magician went for a walk along the deck of the ship. There he saw a giant water snake jumping out of the ocean. Suddenly, he heard one of the passengers calling the serpent the God Eater. The stranger turned out to be Claire. She was accompanied by an unknown guy. The girl introduced Albert to the guy, who turned out to be her older brother Richard. The guy looked as gorgeous as his beautiful sister. Suddenly, the hero grabbed his mouth. He could barely contain his laughter. He was rolling on his bed laughing because his brother's shortened name sounded like an obscene word. Having laughed his fill, the protagonist wiped away his tears and decided to apologize the next time they met. Albert jumped from his bunk from the sudden jolt as the ship entered the waters of the endless sea. The guy went up on deck to explore previously unknown territories. He watched the artillery ships accompanying them. The hero dreamed of seeing them in action. Suddenly, Richard appeared. He too was delighted with the power of these weapons. The boy believed that their destinies were connected because they both abandoned alchemy for forging. Richard examined the runes that Albert was working on. The young man realized that the hero was planning to create a device for transmitting information over very long distances. Richard was amazed by his invention. He would never have thought of such a thing himself. Suddenly, a strange signal went off on the ship. A whole squad of people flew out on giant birds. They were called the Golden Patrol. Using hooks, they pulled a whale of enormous size out of the water. Albert watched their well-coordinated work with rapture. The animal's carcass was lifted into the air. Its meat was dangerous to people. The hero came up with the idea of creating his own navy in the future. But it seems his dreams are not destined to come true, because one cannon shot costs almost 100,000 spiritual stones. 3 days passed, during which time the magician concluded that the sect valued blacksmiths most. The main character was called out by Richard, who told his mentor about his idea. The young man led Albert to the forge hall located on the ship. It was a gigantic room where work was in full swing. The boys walked to the mentor's office. The hero bowed to him. The old man praised the guy and said that this system could be developed and cover the entire continent with communications. The mentor invited the main character to become a student. The magician politely refused, arguing that he wanted to develop both forging and alchemy. After these words, the old man's gaze became truly eerie. A moment later, the teacher just laughed and noticed the boy's sincerity. The old man mentioned that his offer still stood, but he would have to give up alchemy. The mentor gave the hero a special pass to access the inner sector. He will wait for him there. Albert sincerely thanked the old man for his understanding and left. After he left, Richard fell on one knee and asked his mentor for forgiveness for his friend's insolent behavior. The old man regretted that he would not be able to take part in the hero's development into a true master. Albert walked along the deck of the ship and thought about the old man's words. Besides, he had a dilemma. He couldn't decide between Claire and Lily. Suddenly, the ship's artillery sounded the alarm. The main ship was immediately covered with a special protective dome. Terrible sea monsters appeared right on the expedition's route. The enemy was fired upon with all available guns. After a while, the clouds dispersed, and only the corpses of defeated monsters lay in the sea. The protagonist watched as members of the Golden Patrol went in search of resources. Nicholas suddenly appeared out of nowhere and explained that such flocks usually guard something valuable. The young man apologized for his behavior. Last time he got drunk and passed out. The guy also said that many great warriors spend their last years at sea before their ascension, so their abodes can be found here. The hero thanked his friend for the useful information and was eager to loot a couple of them. Suddenly, an entire city appeared before Albert and Nicholas's eyes. The protagonist was surprised. The young man explained that it was just a divine relic found at the site of the victory over the sea creatures. Nicholas grabbed the magician by the hand and carried him straight to the magical city. Just after passing through the gate, the hero came across Claire waving sweetly at him. The girl greeted the hero. She did not expect to see him here. Suddenly, Richard interrupted the conversation and offered Albert to rent a blacksmith shop for the two of them. Claire suggested practicing alchemy with ingredients raised from the seabed. The hero replied that he would rather go with the girl. Thomas appeared unexpectedly and interrupted their pleasant conversation. Father ordered Claire to follow him immediately. Albert and the girl waved goodbye to each other. After some time, the hero and Richard were drinking tea and talking in their workshop. Suddenly, a girl appeared on the threshold and asked if they repaired alchemy cauldrons. She was quite attractive, so the protagonist, who knew a little about the craft, approached her. The girl made cute eyes and asked for help. She needed the cauldron very soon. The guy examined the device and offered to pay 50 spiritual stones and some more for its repair. When the girl gave him everything he needed, the hero set to work. He not only fixed the boiler, but also strengthened it to give the beauty a small bonus. The magician handed the result of his hard work to the beautiful girl. She grabbed the pot and rushed away, even leaving behind some extra ore. After that, the boy spent a whole month sitting in the forge and fulfilling various orders. The guy told his friend that he had imagined the expedition a little differently. Richard understood his friend, so he suggested that they take a walk around the city. The main character, as if stung, hurried to jump on the ship and set off to explore the sea. Surprisingly, almost the entire surface of the water was strewn with various monsters. After a long search, Albert found a safe place and decided to dive underwater. To do this, he took a tourist submarine and put an invisibility dome on it. Half an hour later, the hero dived to a depth of about 50,000 meters. His main goal was to try to find the treasure. Looking forward, the main character saw a terrible monster. It was a dolphin. Its eye was shining like a cyborg's. Meanwhile, Nicholas, who miraculously happened to be nearby, tried to overcome the giant fish. The boy was talking to his mentor using a special technique. The man was a master in swordsmanship. The monster's spine could be used to make an excellent weapon, so the mentor ordered the student to swim to his comrade for help. Nicholas didn't want to endanger Albert's life, so he turned around and took the blow from the fish. The mentor assured him to trust him. The boy had no choice. He headed towards the hero. At this time, the magician was busy collecting useful pearls from the bottom of the sea. He felt uncomfortable, and the protagonist had a bad feeling. He hurried to swim to the surface as quickly as possible, and a terrible roar sounded behind him. Through the submarine's porthole, Albert saw Nicholas. The boy was bleeding. The hero helped his friend get inside. The wounded Nicholas reported that the monster was almost defeated, but it needed to be finished off. After these words, the exhausted guy lost consciousness. The main character was furious at what he heard. His trip was not going well at all. The fish rushed towards the boat, and an unknown glow shone above the vessel. It was Albert. He put on special armor so as not to take so many risks. The guy threw the harpoon with all his might into the monster's face. After this, he began to circle around the creature, who did not understand anything. The hero used a powerful technique, and hundreds of sharp spears rushed into the monster's body. Suddenly, the bloodthirsty fish disappeared from sight. The magician felt her behind his back. The monster turned out to be cunning. Albert threw several silver balls towards the creature. These were his fighting dolls, but they turned out to be unsuitable for underwater combat. The hero only planned to distract the monster and accumulate energy to create several clones. Meanwhile, the fish tried to fight off the attacking snakes. The magician finally gathered his strength and prepared for the final attack. The crystal he created shattered into a pile of fragments, and they began to approach the now helpless monster. Everything around was filled with a blue glow, and a strong whirlpool began to form. The sharp ends of the crystals pierced the fish's flesh like swords. Albert chuckled at his once powerful opponent. The whirlpool's current was so strong that the fish was twisted and all its bones were broken. The hero felt sorry for his snakes. The victory cost him 80,000 spiritual stones. The sword master who observed the fight recognized the protagonist's talent. The magician returned to the ship and gave Nicholas the medicine. The guy came to and asked for forgiveness for getting his friend into trouble again.